My name is Alexander. I'm 52 years old. And what you're about to hear is not a love story, but a lesson about consequences. There are people who believe control is a form of protection, when in reality, it's the fuse of their own destruction. She thought placing a tracker inside the lining of my suitcase before my business trip was a masterstroke, a kind of insurance policy for her lies. What she never imagined was that I already knew that device was there from the very moment I heard the small metallic click inside the closet. That little gadget, no bigger than a coin, ended up costing her her house, her reputation, and the respect of everyone who knew her. It was the most expensive mistake of her life. My wife tried to hunt a man who was already 3 steps ahead of her, and when she finally decided to check the location on her phone, what she found wasn't an affair. It was the absolute emptiness of her own future. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave a like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. I had been married to Eleanor for 19 years. 19 years of what I believed was a solid construction, a building raised with effort, necessary silences, and a loyalty I had always taken for granted. At 52, a man learns to value stability more than reckless passion. I am a man of numbers, of logistics, someone who understands that when the pieces don't fit, the structure collapses. My life was methodical. I woke up before she did, prepared the coffee in silence, and reviewed the consulting firm's reports before the sun had fully risen. She, on the other hand, had always been more volatile, more concerned with appearances, with the shine of jewelry and the approval of social media. Despite our differences, I believed we had an unspoken pact of mutual respect. We had a large house, no debt, and a bank account that allowed us not to worry about the price of anything. I gave her everything a woman in her circle could desire: security, status, and absolute financial freedom. But the mistake many men my age make is confusing comfort with loyalty. The world we moved in was a nest of appearances. Charity dinners, business gatherings where the wives compare their surgeries and the husbands compare their watches. I always kept a certain distance from that falseness, observing from afar with the coldness that defines me. However, in the last 6 months, I noticed something in the air of our house had changed. The emotional temperature had dropped several degrees. Eleanor began showing a strange anxiety, a need to know my schedule down to the minute, something she had never cared about before. She asked about my trips with an insistence that bordered on pathological. What time does your flight land? Which hotel exactly are you staying at? Who's going to the closing dinner? I answered with the truth, with the calm that has always been my greatest weapon. But my instinct, the same one that has helped me close multi-million-dollar deals, told me she wasn't looking for reassurance. She was projecting her own fears. A man with my experience knows that the one who watches desperately is the one hiding something. Trust is a piece of glass that doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks slowly, with small lies, with calls that suddenly end when you walk into the room, with phones placed face down on the nightstand. I saw all of it. I saw how she avoided my gaze at dinner, how she lost herself in her screen for hours, smiling in a way that no longer belonged to me. But I am not a man of dramatic scenes or shouting. I wasn't going to lower myself to checking her purse or demanding explanations she would simply deny with a nervous laugh. I decided to observe. The status of our relationship had become a cold truce. I continued providing, she continued spending, but the bond between us had turned into a contract that was about to expire. A few days before my scheduled trip to supervise the opening of a new branch office, I found her in the dressing room. She had her back turned, handling my favorite leather suitcase, the one I always use for short trips. When she sensed my presence, she gave an almost imperceptible jump and closed the inner compartment with clumsy speed. She looked at me with a forced smile, the kind people use with strangers in an elevator. She said she was just checking whether the lining needed to be sent for cleaning. I said nothing. I simply nodded and gave her a dry kiss on the cheek. As soon as she left the room to answer a phone call, I opened the suitcase. I didn't have to search for long. Hidden behind the seam of the secret pocket, I felt the circular bulge, a high-precision tracker, the kind that syncs with a phone and shows real-time location with a margin of error of only a few meters. I stared at it for a few seconds. I didn't feel pain. I felt a cold disappointment. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was underestimating me. She believed she could play espionage games with someone who had spent half his life detecting financial fraud. In that moment, while holding the suitcase, I understood that my marriage was over. But the ending would not be written by her. She wanted to know where I was to make sure her lover and she had a clear path, or perhaps to try to catch me in something she could later use in a divorce. Whatever the reason, I realized she was no longer my partner. She was an adversary, and adversaries are not confronted, they are dismantled. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the tracker, and began calculating the price of her betrayal. I knew she believed she had control of the situation, that she saw me as the predictable husband who simply came and went according to his schedule. What she didn't know was that by placing that tracker on me, she had handed me the perfect tool to destroy her. The trip that was about to begin would not be a business trip, at least not the kind she expected. It would be the beginning of a full audit of our life together, and the final balance for her was going to be devastating. The trip arrived, and with it came the confirmation of what my instincts had already declared. I left the house that morning with my suitcase in hand and the tracker sending constant signals to her phone. Eleanor said goodbye with an unusually long hug, almost theatrical. I could feel her relief the moment I closed the car door, a relief only felt by someone who believes they've just taken the trash out and now have the house free to dirty again. I didn't drive to the airport right away. Before making any move, I needed proof, not just suspicion. I had hired a professional, a man who asks no questions and delivers results in encrypted digital folders. As I drove toward a discreet cafe to meet him, I knew Eleanor was staring at her screen, watching my little blue dot move across the map, convinced she had me under her thumb. In that cafe, I received the first slap of reality. The investigator handed me a tablet. The photos didn't lie. It wasn't a one-night mistake or some impulsive slip. It was a parallel relationship that had lasted almost 2 years. The man was about 10 years younger than me, a tennis instructor she supposedly took lessons from 3 times a week. I saw him in the photos walking into our house, wearing my bathrobe, drinking from my private whiskey collection, while I was at the office closing deals to pay for her trips to Europe. The humiliation wasn't the affair itself. It was the invasion of my sanctuary. Seeing a stranger sitting in my favorite chair, laughing with the woman I had trusted with my life, gave me a dry wave of nausea. But my face didn't change. I kept drinking my black coffee, studying every detail of the betrayal. I discovered that Eleanor wasn't just cheating on me emotionally and physically. She was also diverting money from our joint account into a personal account I didn't know existed. She had been financing that man's life with my work. The tracker she placed on me wasn't about jealousy. It was about operational security. She needed to know exactly how much time she had for the man to leave through the back door before I put my key in the lock. That afternoon, instead of boarding my flight, I did something different. I went to a camping supply store and bought a small portable cooler. I placed the suitcase, with the tracker still inside, into it and handed it to a trusted transporter who was driving by road to a remote rural area 500 kilometers in the opposite direction of my supposed business destination. I paid him to drive without stopping and then leave the suitcase at a rundown roadside motel. Meanwhile, I checked into a small hotel under a false name, just 10 minutes from my own house. Seeing my home from the outside, knowing what was happening inside, was the most painful symbolic eviction I have ever felt. It was no longer my home. It was a stage of disgrace. I spent the night awake, watching the blue dot on Eleanor's phone travel toward nowhere, giving her the false confidence that I was far away, very far away. That night she didn't call to say goodnight, neither did I. Silence was the sound of a contract breaking, I felt like a stranger in my own life, a 52-year-old man who had built an empire on quicksand. My home, my peace, and my dignity had been taken from me in a single stroke. But while she celebrated her temporary freedom with that man in my bed, I sat in that dark hotel room with a notebook and a pen, drawing the lines of her downfall. She believed she had taken me out of the game. What she had really done was give me the freedom to act without the burden of guilt. My expulsion from my own life was complete. Now all that remained was to decide what ashes I would leave for her to gather. The following morning brought no comfort, only crystal clarity. I woke up in that unfamiliar hotel room with a single idea in my mind: precision. At my age, a man doesn't look for street fights or shouting matches in the living room. He looks for a technical execution. My first step was to call Daniel Carter, a lawyer who specializes in high-profile divorces, the kind of man who doesn't walk into a courtroom to negotiate, but to perform an autopsy. We met in a private office without windows, where the smell of old coffee and paper filled the air. I placed the tablet with the photos in front of him. Daniel didn't react. He slid through the images with his finger, pausing at one where the tennis instructor was leaving my house, carrying one of my bottles of collectible wine. Daniel looked at me over his glasses and said the photos were good, but the tracker was a gift from heaven. By placing a surveillance device in my belongings without my consent, Eleanor had not only violated my privacy, she had committed a crime that invalidated any claim of good faith in a civil proceeding. My plan wasn't just divorce. I wanted the cost of her betrayal to equal exactly the value of what she had stolen from me: my time, my trust, and my estate. Over the next 3 days, while the tracker in my suitcase continued traveling inside a cargo truck toward a mining region nearly 800 kilometers away, I focused on dismantling our financial infrastructure. Eleanor believed she had access to everything, but I had structured our assets in a way that made me the sole administrator of the companies that owned our properties. With Daniel's signature and a couple of notaries who owed him favors, I began the process of liquidating the joint account. I didn't leave the account empty. That would have been a rookie mistake. I left exactly enough for her to pay the household bills for 1 month. But I blocked every corporate credit card she used for her indulgences and for the luxuries of her lover. Every move was calculated, cold, and legal. Meanwhile, the private investigator kept sending me updates. Eleanor was so confident while watching the blue dot on her phone floating somewhere in the middle of nowhere that she didn't even bother closing the curtains of the house. The man was practically living there. My reconstruction wasn't just financial, it was mental. I forced myself to see every corner of my life as a chess piece. I didn't feel hatred. Hatred clouds judgment. What I felt was the satisfaction of an architect who finds a structural flaw and decides demolition is better than repair. Thanks to bank records, I discovered Eleanor had promised her lover she would invest in a gym for him. They had already been scouting locations. She was selling my work as if it were her inheritance. That was when I introduced the final strategic detail. I knew Eleanor's father, a man from the old school, conservative, with an almost medieval sense of honor, was the one who upheld the social reputation of her family. He adored her. He saw her as the perfect daughter. I decided he would be the first spectator of the climax, not out of cruelty toward him, but because moral justice requires the mask to fall in front of those who matter most. I prepared a manila envelope with the photos, the bank statements showing the diverted money, and most importantly, the record of the tracker she had placed on me. I attached a short note, handwritten in my calmest script. This is what Eleanor's tracker discovered while I was working. Patience is a virtue cultivated with age. Watching her send me text messages pretending to miss me, asking how the weather was on my supposed trip while I was looking at photos of her dining at my table with that man, was the ultimate test of my self-control. I didn't answer with anger. I answered with monosyllables, feeding her confidence. She believed I was the boring, predictable husband being deceived. I knew she was the woman who was about to lose everything, while tracking an empty suitcase in a town that doesn't even exist on the map of her future. The 5th day was the moment of execution. The tracker in my suitcase had finally stopped at a dusty gas station on the outskirts of a mining town, a place where the wind carries nothing but forgetfulness. Eleanor, watching the motionless dot on her screen, assumed I had settled into my hotel, busy with meetings. That was when I decided to return to my own house. But I didn't enter through the front door. I parked a block away and waited. At 7 in the evening, the tennis instructor's sports car pulled up in front of my garage with insulting familiarity. I watched him step out, stretch with the arrogance of someone who believes he owns land he never planted, and walk inside using his own copy of the keys. I waited exactly 30 minutes. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted their guard completely down. I walked in with the calm of a man returning from a Sunday stroll. When I opened the door, the silence of the house was broken by the sound of soft music and the clinking of crystal glasses upstairs. I climbed the stairs without a sound. My leather shoes didn't make a single creak on the carpet I had personally paid for 3 years earlier. When I opened the door to our master bedroom, the scene was exactly what the investigator had described in his reports. But seeing it in 3 dimensions, with the scent of her perfume mixed with that of a stranger, was the point of no return. Eleanor let out a muffled scream, an animal sound of pure terror, and pulled the sheets over herself. The tennis guy tried to stand up with a bravery that evaporated the moment he saw that I wasn't holding a weapon, but something far more dangerous, a phone recording and a folder full of documents. I didn't shout. I didn't throw a single punch. I simply stood in the doorway, watching them with a coldness that seemed to freeze the air in the room. Eleanor began stammering, saying it wasn't what it looked like, the automatic lie of someone caught red-handed. I took out my phone, opened the tracking app, and showed it to her. In a voice so low they had to strain to hear it, I told her that her tracker was 800 kilometers away from here, in the hands of a truck driver who had probably already thrown it in the trash. I told her that while she was entertaining herself playing amateur spy, I had been with my lawyer signing the transfer of ownership of this house to one of my holding companies, and that legally she no longer had the right to be here. Eleanor's face shifted from the red of shame to the pale white of absolute panic. While the man struggled to put on his pants, tripping over his own feet, I informed her that all her credit cards had been canceled 2 hours earlier. I also mentioned that the envelope with the photos and the financial transfers was already in her father's hands, and that at this very moment he was probably reading the detailed list of how his perfect daughter had squandered the family's honor on a gym instructor. The climax wasn't an explosion. It was the implantation of reality. Watching that woman, who had always bragged about her elegance and social control, begging in her underwear while her lover searched for the nearest exit without even looking back at her, was the purest form of justice I have ever experienced. The man ran out of the room, leaving behind his watch and his dignity. Eleanor tried to grab my arm, crying, begging for a chance to explain. I stepped away with a gesture of disgust, like someone avoiding a grease stain on a clean suit. I told her she had exactly 1 hour to pack whatever she could carry in her hands. Everything else, the furniture, the jewelry I bought her, the designer dresses, would remain locked inside the house as compensation for the money she had stolen from the joint account. The irony was exquisite. She placed a tracker on me to monitor my movements, and ended up revealing her own. The cost of that small device was not the $50 she paid for it, but the total destruction of the luxurious life she had worked so hard to display. I left her there, collapsed on the floor, realizing that the man she thought she was manipulating was the architect of her ruin. I walked out of the room, closed the door, and went downstairs, leaving behind 19 years of lies with the satisfaction of a man who had finally balanced the books. The silence that remained in the house after Eleanor left with 2 poorly packed suitcases was the most gratifying sound I had heard in decades. There were no final screams, only the echo of the door closing and the engine of a taxi fading into the distance. Hours later, I received a message from her father. He didn't apologize for her. He simply wrote, "I understand." A man of honor knows when a debt cannot be repaid. Eleanor ended up living in a small rented apartment, far from the social circle she loved so much, working an administrative job that barely covers her expenses. The tennis instructor, as expected, disappeared from her life the moment the flow of money stopped. Parasites don't stay when the host runs dry. At 52 years old, I returned to single life with a different perspective. I don't feel lonely. I feel free from the burden of watching someone who was supposed to watch my back. People often ask me if the betrayal hurt. The truth is, pain is a luxury I never allowed myself. I chose the efficiency of justice instead. She believed that a small piece of plastic and a satellite would give her power, but she forgot that technology does not replace intelligence. Her biggest mistake was believing my silence meant ignorance, when in reality, it was simply the time I needed to build her cage. Today, my life is quiet and my businesses are more prosperous than ever. I hold no resentment, because resentment is a poison you drink, hoping the other person will die. I simply closed a branch that wasn't profitable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories.